Hello and welcome. This tutorial is for first-time players of Life is Feudal Forest Village. When generating a map, I like to start with a normal-sized map instead of small because I find that generates bigger areas of flat land, which is shown by this beige color here. Buildings can only be placed on flat land, so the more of this color you have around your starting area, the less terraforming you will have to do later on. We can move around our start location by changing out the last digit of the map seed, for example. And this puts our start location in a more favorable area. We also want to make sure that we start with a sharp, clean coastline. We don't want it to look ragged or fuzzy looking like this part here. That indicates shallow water. We want to start with deep water because that's better for fishing. We have two options for climate, which is mild and harsh. Mild means a longer warm season, so you have more time to grow and gather food. And harsh means a longer cold season. Not only do you have less time to gather food, but you need to put more of your lumber towards producing firewood. And what that will do is it will slow down your expansion because the more wood that goes towards firewood production, the less you have for building. Starting without houses reduces your starting land and your resources, and you will begin the game with only 2 adult villagers. Let's start with houses so that we start with a decent amount of resources and 6 adult villagers. And I'm going to leave disasters on so that you can see all the fun stuff that can go wrong with your village. Now, when the game loads, I'm going to hit the space bar and pause it, and I'm just going to talk about the villagers and their functions. So we pause. So these are your villagers, and they have 3 stages of growth, which is child, teenager, and adult. So the way that children are born, well, if you don't know, you should ask your parents, but in this game, children are born whenever there is space available in a house and you have an adult female resident. So although we have 2 adult females in this house, there is no available room, and so no children will be born. Do not upgrade a house that has a child in it if they have no other house to move into. If you do so, they will die of exposure to the elements. Make sure that you have additional housing before you upgrade one that has a child in it. Teenagers and adults can survive outside the home for a short time, so this house is going to be safe to upgrade. The next stage of growth is teenager. And when a child becomes a teenager, you'll see a notice that says that they have grown up and are ready to study. By study, that means go to school. Our adult villagers have a book next to their portrait, which means they are educated, which means they are a slightly more effective worker. Unfortunately, we will not have a school built by the time these teenagers come of age, so we will have a sort of lost generation in terms of schooling. The final stage of growth is adult. And when an adult starts working, they automatically begin as a laborer. And if we come down here to the profession menu, this is the total number of adults in the village. None of them are assigned to a task, therefore they are laborers. Now, it's okay to have some workers not assigned to a job because laborers will do important things like collecting resources. They will also build roads. Okay. And most importantly, they will carry resources to build sites in addition to the assigned builder. So anytime you're about to get started on a big construction project, you want to make sure that you have a lot of laborers on hand to start bringing over materials for that building. So let's get started. We will unpause the game and allow our laborers to bring resources over. Now, as you can see, the adults are beginning work, but the teenagers are just standing around doing nothing, and we can't have that. What you can do is you can click on their portrait to enter first-person mode, and with this, you have some useful options available to you. You can go hunting. You can also plant trees around your village, which you cut down later for lumber. And you also have available to you this number 1 option, which is a sort of village horn that anyone can blow, and it will speed up workers for a short amount of time. There are times when you don't want to use this option, which is whenever teenagers or adults are carrying resources to build sites or whenever they are bringing resources to their home. For some reason, they will just turn around and bring the resources back. But that's only if you select that specific villager who is bringing in the resources. I know that's confusing. You'll figure it out. All right, so it looks like all of our resources are here and the builder should be getting started. Where are they? We can click on this button here to find out where they are. Hop to it, Nolan. We need to get some more housing. All right, now we need to think about food production. If you want to, you can start off with a field right away. Just know that as soon as it's done being built, you need to select vegetables and start planting right away. And then before it gets too cold, before snow starts to form on the ground, then you need to begin harvesting. I don't like to start with the field because normally you would be seeding plants in early spring, and that way you can make sure that you get the whole harvest in by fall. But it is already the middle of spring, and I find that I don't get as much food in if I start with a field right off the bat. I like to begin with the gatherer's hut because once that is built, they can start picking up vegetables right away on the ground. There are all kinds of fruits and vegetables growing here, and they don't have to wait for anything to grow. Now, the thing to note about placing a building down is that when you place it on top of these resources here, these trees and stones and so forth, any resources that it is placed on top of will go towards the construction of the building, and that reduces the amount of time that laborers have to spend bringing resources over to the building. So we can cut down on that a little bit by placing this on top of, I think we can get all of these stones in here plus that tree. I also want to make sure that this building is not too close to the village, because not a lot of vegetables grow around here. I also want to make sure that it's not too far away, because once it gets cold, the further a villager has to travel away from the village, the higher the chances that they will catch hypothermia. So let's put this down right about there. I think we can get both of those trees in if we put it just there. So that's the gatherer's hut, and the other building I'm going to put down right next to it is the hunting cabin. And that way they can start collecting fur and meat. Now, one thing to know about these two buildings is that they rely on being in a forested area. And once we start cutting down trees, that's going to reduce the amount of food that these workers can pick up. So for that reason, when I put down the Forester's Lodge, which will help us automate cutting down lumber, I don't want it to be overlapping the work area of these two buildings. I want it to be a little bit off center, so I think I will put this on top of some resources. Okay, I guess we'll put it right here on top of this tree. Lovely. And yeah, that's good for now. Later on, I'll put a second one here to cut down these trees, and that way, once that's built, I can have my foresters go back and forth between these two structures, cutting down this area, and then while they're cutting down this area here, these trees will start growing back, and that way at no point will the hunting cabin and the gathering hut be in a totally deforested area. So it looks like we have a lot of work for our villagers to do. Let's add 3 builders, and we'll keep 3 on building this road. And of course, our teenagers, because they're not doing anything, can use the village horn option, and I'm also going to have them go around and start helping out. And the way that they can do that is that they can either collect resources off the ground, cut down trees that have reached their full growth, or I like to start off with some hunting, because if you see that moose over there, we're going to see a lot less of these kinds of animals as our village expands. And these animals have a lot of meat, and so I like to go around the village and... what is this one doing? Anyway, go around the village and, hunt any animal that produces a lot of meat. So the animals that produce fur are wolves, foxes, and bears. And the animals that produce meat are deer, boars, and moose. And I'm only going to focus on meat producing animals for now, because we're not going to be making clothing for a bit. So I don't especially care about fur producing animals. Now, all of these baskets of meat that are getting left behind will get picked up eventually, either by the hunters if it falls within their work area, or it will be picked up by a laborer eventually. All right, it looks like our gathering hut is now complete. So I'm going to take some workers off of building, and I'm going to put as many workers as I can onto gathering vegetables because we're going to burn through this food pretty quickly, and I want to start gathering food right away. And as soon as the hunting cabin is built, I'm just gonna put one worker onto that for now. As for the remaining workers, once they've finished constructing this building, I'm gonna have them start to build roads, which will give our other workers a nice little speed buff. Now, the two most commonly used buildings in your village are the barn and the warehouse. So we always want our roads to be leading back to those two buildings. Now, I can't put a road here because I haven't cleared away these shacks yet, but if I follow this grid, I can kind of see where the road will end up once I delete those buildings. I'll just have it go out to here, and I will have this one go to about here. And that will especially help our woodcutters in the winter so that they can get back to the village a little more quickly. All right, now once those roads are built, we need to construct a very essential building, which is the Lumberjacks Lodge, and that's going to help our workers convert raw lumber into firewood, which we will definitely burn through a lot of because our villagers don't really have good clothing to wear. Now, I want to put this building right next to the barn because that's where firewood is going to end up. Anytime you place down a structure, take note of what raw materials it needs and where those materials are going to end up, which is the barn. So we want to make sure that a production building is always nearby to either a barn or a warehouse. And furthermore, this warehouse is not going to stay here forever. It's kind of tucked away in a very inconvenient corner of the map, considering that all of these resources are eventually going to end up in that warehouse. Eventually, we want to shift this building away, and you do that by removing the building, but we don't want to do that yet because we don't have another warehouse to transfer that stuff into. So I'm going to put that here right next to the barn, but I need to get rid of this hut first. I can't get rid of the hut because those villagers will have nowhere to move into. So let's build them a proper house. Don't bother building shacks. They are a waste of space because they can only be expanded up to 4 villagers. I mean, I think they're kind of cute looking, but we want to make sure that our villagers are in proper housing. So we're going to put down a house here, and I will assign one of our road builders onto that task. So when it comes to expanding housing, we don't want to expand too quickly. You can build one of these larger houses if you want right off the bat. And I think later on we will build one of these once we have more adults in the village. But we don't want to do that yet because what will happen is we're going to have like a huge baby boom, and what we'll have is a bunch of babies sitting around being useless, doing nothing, consuming resources, and not giving any resources back to the village. As soon as this house is built, it will have a capacity of 5, and the moment it's done, I'm going to delete this shack, and so these 3 villagers can move into that building, and that will create an additional 2 slots of population so that 2 children can be born. And note that villagers' houses are not permanent. They will move around according to where their job is. They like to be in a house which is closest to their job. And so if I was to build that forester's lodge right now, if I put it right here, those 2 foresters would end up living in the closest available housing. All right, let's plop down our Lumberjacks Lodge. Soon it is going to be winter, so we want to make sure that we begin the winter with a lot of food and a lot of lumber. Now, normally I would save wood cutting for the winter once we've finished bringing in the harvests, but we're going to start a little bit early this year because we need a lot of lumber for the construction that we're going to do and for the Lumberjacks Lodge. So I'm going to start a little early this year on wood cutting and put 2 of my workers onto that task. And I've put the other worker onto bringing in those baskets of meat that our teenagers left behind when they were hunting. Once the temperature starts to drop, you'll eventually see this symbol appear over the gathering hut, But actually, there are still some vegetables on the ground, and they can continue to harvest those vegetables even when the temperature drops. As it drops lower, though, they will start to die off eventually. What I like to do during the winter, because there's not as much food production, is I save winter for gathering materials that we're going to need for building. And this winter, we're going to set up our tool production, and for that, we're going to need about 200 stone. We're going to need about 150 ore, and let's collect some of the straw that's in the area as well. Now, the way this resource collection works is the villagers collect it in the order that you assigned it. So first they'll bring in all that stone, and then the ore, and then the straw. We're going to get started on tool production. Now, if you want to create primitive tools, you can just start with the, I don't even remember what it's called because I don't use it, the carpenter shop, and that uses wood and stone to produce these crappy primitive tools. But I like to get started right away with the high quality tools, and for that we're going to need a kiln, and that's going to convert firewood into charcoal, and we will also need the furnace, and that will use ore and charcoal to produce cast iron. Before we do that, we want to ban the villagers from using charcoal, and we do that by double clicking, otherwise they will use it to heat their homes. And then the last building that we will need for tool production is the blacksmith shop, and I'm going to put that right in front of the barn, so that's where those tools will end up. One thing to note about building sites is that they will eat up all of your resources unless you tell the villagers not to bring resources to that build site, and we do that by pausing, and that way all of the wood that's being brought in can be used by the lumberjacks instead of getting used for this construction site. So if you have too many build sites going on at once, that's a good way to manage your resources. So we're just about through with winter. It's now spring, and we are almost finished with our tool production buildings. Instead of having one worker on each of these tasks, you can just put one worker onto charcoal and then move him onto cast iron and then move him onto tool production. And that way you can have one worker bounce between the 3 jobs rather than place 3 different villagers onto those tasks, because we already need to get started with food production. So we're going to take our foresters off of that because trees are going to grow the fastest during spring and summer. So we don't want to be cutting during those seasons. We want to let the trees grow. And because it is now spring, we need to jump back onto food production. And in addition to the hunting lodge and the gathering hut, we're also going to produce some fish. Fishing is kind of a backup food source. The amount of fish that you bring in is going to diminish over time, so it's not really super reliable. Yeah, that's kind of how the rotation works, is that food production is going to be spring, summer, and fall. Winter is going to be reserved for wood cutting, gathering resources, and construction. The last thing that I'm going to have the builders work on, even though it's already late spring, is a couple of fields. There's a lot of ways that you can do farming. You can have one big field and just have all the workers work on that. You can have a bunch of little fields. It is completely up to you, and there are some really good tutorials already out there that focus just on farming that I'll link in the description. But the way I like to do it is I like to have one main field, which is for vegetables. And then I like to have another smaller field, and that is going to be used for growing things like flax for clothing, and it's going to be used for hay, which is for construction, and oats once we start having chickens. Now, remember how we used the pause function in order to stop resources from going to one of our build sites? You can also use that function to plan out your village. For example, we don't have all the resources for this yet, but I know that I want to put a house here eventually. So I'll place that down and I'll pause it, and that way we know where we're going to put roads eventually. So I'm going to put a field on the other side of the first one. And what I also like to put down is under decorations, you can find the scarecrow. And the description says that it deters birds and accelerates growth. of crops. I don't know how much of a difference this thing actually makes, but I do think that it speeds up the crops a little bit. So plus it's cute, so I like to build it. Put that there, and build a road where the entrance is going to go. And so this way we know where to put our roads. Now wherever you put down fields, you also need to have a water source. Under municipal buildings, we're going to find the well, and we're going to put that down. And that way, in case there's not a lot of rain in the spring, they have a water source that they can use to water the crops. Now because we only have one barn, and it's kind of far from where our fields are, I like to have another barn which is going to be sort of an overflow. And I'm going to put it right next to the fields. That way, if our farmers are bringing in the harvest and they're running a little bit late, there's a barn right there for them to drop off the crop. But I think, yeah, this ground here is a little bit uneven, as you can see, so we need to terraform it, and we find that here. We'll make it level. Just highlight the area where the building is going to go, and I think that should do it. It is fall once again, and we're just finishing up this house here. We are bringing in our harvest, or at least as much of it as we can. Once we've cleared this hut and transferred the villagers over into that house, I'm going to put a weaver's workshop here and get that built, and then next spring we're going to plant vegetables and flax. One more thing that we need to start thinking about is switching from using this function to collect resources over to mining. And the way that we start mining is we use these options here to bring up a heat map. And that's going to show where we can find high concentrations of stone, ore, and clay. So I like to start with stone. Now we definitely will not have the lumber to build this, probably for at least another year. It's good to know where we're going to place it, and so that way we don't build any structures over valuable areas of ore. So I like to put, I don't want to put this too far away. So I think I'm going to put this right about here. And I think we'll just put the ore right next to it. As for clay, we really don't use that much clay, so we can kind of put this out of the way somewhere. I think we'll just sort of put it off to the edge. Once we get our main structures built, we almost never use clay. So we'll put that there. And it's really important that we pause these so that all of our lumber doesn't start going towards these build sites, because it's time to once again start collecting lumber, start producing firewood, take our workers off of food production, and get them started with resources. So here we are, year 6, and we have all of our mines built. Once you begin mining, you need to build some kind of construction to take care of dead bodies, because villagers are going to die in the mines all the time. So you can either build a... How do you pronounce pyre? Pier? Pyre. Pyre. Okay. You can either build a funeral pyre, or you can build a crypt if you want to use up these stone resources to do so. We've just built our first big house, and to prevent us from having a huge baby boom, we're going to use this opportunity to upgrade some of our smaller houses. And we also want to make sure that we have a school built, so that way once we have a whole bunch of teenagers, they can all start going to school at the same time. Now that we have our mining set up, it's time to start thinking about bigger construction, for example, the port. Now, what the port is going to do is it's going to send out ships, and it's going to bring back resources like sheep and cow. But before we do that, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that needs to get built, starting with the windmill. And with the windmill, we're going to convert grain into flour. And once we have flour, then we can build a bakery to build pies. And once we have pies, then we can start sending out our ships. So there's no point in building a port unless we have all of this stuff built first. So once that is built, then we will construct a bakery. And in order to create those pies, which we're going to send on our ship, we first need to have chickens. Now, chickens are kind of a pain because they can die very easily if you build them too close to a wooded area. They need to be towards the town center where there are not as many animals. If your first chicken gets killed, then you have to deconstruct the coop and rebuild it, and it is very annoying. So make sure that we want to make sure that we build our coop towards the center of town, and chickens require oats, so let's get started with those and make sure that we have a lot on hand before we build our chicken coop. So it is now year 10, and I've just taken the workers off of their warm season tasks, and we're just getting ready to send out our first ship. We're going to look for sheep so that we can make better clothing than what we have. I have had the best luck sending out a ship in the late fall or early winter, which makes sense because during the summer there are storms. You still always have the risk of a ship going down with a storm. So we have all of the pies that we need. We have all of the resources that we need. We just need to get that ship built and sent out. And once that is sent out, then we'll have a timer on the port which shows us when it will be returning. In the meantime, there are two things that we can do to make ourselves more prepared for disasters, which do start to become more common around year 10. For example, you're more likely to start seeing outbreaks of diseases like rabies or plague. To solve that, what you do is you build the herbalist's hut, and they will gather herbs during the warm season. And then if people get sick, then you apply a worker to the healer's shop. And this takes a lot of resources to build, so we do want to get that started on sometime while we're building all of our other stuff as well, so that we have it ready in time. The other disaster we need to think about is raiders, and when that happens, you'll get a notice right here in the event log, and you can see their ship moving on the mini-map. All you have to do is wait for them to land on the island, and then click on the event log, and follow their progress through the forest, and just before they start to reach the clearing where your village is, just select the nearest villager and have them go into the woods and shoot all the raiders before they can arrive at your village. If they do arrive, then they will just start burning down buildings left and right, and it's very annoying. So make sure you have a lot of wells, make sure that you are prepared for when they arrive. You can also start to build these attack towers, and they are very expensive. They use up a lot of resources, mostly stone. I only bother with one or two around the edge of the village just because they are so expensive and because the raiders are very easy to attack. There are some pretty fun mods that will increase the amount of raiders, and that will force you to use a lot of these structures here to make yourself more prepared for defense. So if I hold down tab, I can see all of the structures that have been built in this 10-year period. I think that covers all the basics. The last thing that I will say is that these two buildings that we started with here, the Gathering Hut and the Hunting Lodge, at this point, more than a quarter of their work area is being encroached on by our buildings. And so for that reason, you can either just use them less. We probably won't use that many furs moving forward, especially once we have decent clothing. But you can just separate them and have one hunting and gathering area here and then another hunting and gathering area right here. And that's all I have for this tutorial. I hope that it was helpful, and good luck.